3,200 years ago, there existed a world so advanced, so interconnected, so astonishingly sophisticated that when archaeologists first began to uncover its remains in the 19th century, they refused to believe what they were finding. They found palaces with indoor plumbing. They found international trade routes spanning thousands of miles. They found diplomatic letters between kings who called each other brother, who sent each other gifts of gold and ivory and lapis lazuli, who arranged marriages between their children to secure alliances that stretched across continents. They found evidence of a globalized economy, a network of civilizations so tightly woven together that a shipment of tin from the mountains of Afghanistan could end up in a bronze sword on the coast of Greece, that ebony from the heart of Africa could decorate a throne in Anatolia, that amber from the frozen shores of the Baltic Sea could hang around the neck of an Egyptian queen. This was not the ancient world you were taught about in school. This was something far grander, far more complex, and far more familiar than you might imagine. It was, in many ways, a world that looked remarkably like our own. And then, within a single human lifetime, roughly 50 years, every single one of these civilizations collapsed, not one by one over centuries, not gradually fading the way empires sometimes do. They fell together, almost simultaneously, in a catastrophic cascade that wiped away everything they had built. The palaces burned, the trade routes went silent, the letters stopped, the kings vanished. Writing itself was forgotten in some regions for 400 years, and then, perhaps most remarkably of all, history forgot them. The greatest civilizations ever built were erased so thoroughly from human memory that for 3,000 years nobody even knew they had existed. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your bed and let the weight of the modern world slip away from your shoulders, I am going to take you back to that lost world. I am going to show you what it looked like at its peak, when it was the most magnificent thing humanity had ever created. And then I am going to tell you what destroyed it, because that is where the mystery begins. After more than a century of research, after thousands of excavations and millions of pages of scholarly debate, nobody can fully explain what happened. There are theories. There are suspects. There are clues scattered across the ruins of a dozen ancient cities. But there is no single answer, and the deeper you dig into this story, the more unsettling it becomes, because the world that collapsed 3,200 years ago was not destroyed by something alien or unrecognizable. It was destroyed by forces that are disturbingly familiar. Forces that are at work in our world right now. Let your breathing slow. Let your muscles soften. Let the pillow cradle your head the way the earth cradles the ruins of civilizations that once thought they would last forever. This is a story about power and fragility, about connection and collapse, about the terrifying truth that the more complex a system becomes, the more vulnerable it is to total failure. And it begins not with destruction, but with splendor. Picture the Eastern Mediterranean around the year 1250 BC. This is roughly 50 years before everything falls apart, and the world is magnificent. It is the Late Bronze Age, a period that historians sometimes call the first golden age of international civilization. And if you could somehow transport yourself there, you would find a world buzzing with activity, with trade, with diplomacy, with art and war and ambition and innovation. You would find not one great civilization, but several, all existing simultaneously, all aware of each other, all connected by a web of relationships so intricate and so essential that pulling on any single thread could unravel the whole tapestry. But nobody was thinking about unraveling. Not yet. At this moment in history, the tapestry was the most beautiful thing the world had ever seen. Start in Egypt, because Egypt is the civilization most people know, the one with the pyramids and the pharaohs and the golden masks. But the Egypt of 1250 BC is not the Egypt of the pyramids. The Great Pyramids at Giza were already over 1,000 years old by this point. They were ancient history to the Egyptians themselves, tourist attractions, relics of a distant past. The Egypt of 1250 BC is the Egypt of the New Kingdom, and it is arguably the most powerful version of Egypt that ever existed. The pharaoh's Ramses II, and he's not just a king, he's a force of nature. He will reign for 67 years, longer than most people in his era will live. He will father over 100 children. He will build more monuments, more temples, more statues of himself than any pharaoh before or after. The great temple at Abu Simbel carved directly into a cliff face in southern Egypt, with 4 colossal seated statues of Ramses guarding the entrance, each one 67 feet tall. That is his work. The expansion of the temple complex at Karnak, the largest religious structure ever built, that is his work too. He is vain, ambitious, brilliant, and utterly convinced of his own divinity, and by the standards of his time, he might be right. Egypt, under Ramses II, controls a territory stretching from modern-day Libya in the west to the borders of modern-day Arabia in the east, from the Mediterranean coast in the north deep into Sudan in the south. Its armies are the most feared in the known world. Its wealth is almost incomprehensible. Gold flows from mines in Nubia. Grain flows from the fertile Nile Valley. And tribute flows from vassal states and conquered territories across the Levant. But here is the thing about Ramses that most people do not know, and it is the detail that makes this story so much more interesting than a simple tale of one powerful king. Ramses is not the only great king in the world. He is not even the most powerful, though he would never admit it. To the north, in the heart of what is now Turkey, there exists an empire that matches Egypt in military strength and exceeds it in certain technologies. And this empire, unlike Egypt, has been almost completely forgotten by history. If you have heard of the Hittites, you know more than most people. If you have not, you are about to discover one of the most fascinating lost civilizations in human history, and the story of how they were forgotten is almost as remarkable as the story of how they fell. The Hittites ruled from a city called Hattusa, located in central Anatolia, in the rugged highlands of modern Turkey. And Hattusa was extraordinary. It was one of the largest cities in the ancient world, enclosed by massive stone walls that stretched for more than 6 miles, punctuated by towers and monumental gates decorated with carved lions and sphinxes and warriors. Inside the walls, the city was a sprawling complex of temples, palaces, administrative buildings, and residential quarters, home to tens of thousands of people. The Hittites were warriors and diplomats and administrators of exceptional skill. They had conquered much of Anatolia and extended their influence deep into Syria, bringing them into direct conflict with Egypt over control of the wealthy Levantine coast. And they had something that gave them a technological edge that no other civilization could match. They knew how to smelt iron. Now, this might not sound impressive to modern ears. Iron is everywhere today. But in the Bronze Age, iron was rarer than gold. The process of smelting it, of extracting usable metal from iron ore, was a closely guarded secret, and the Hittites guarded it more closely than any other secret in their empire. They understood that iron weapons were harder and held a sharper edge than bronze weapons. They understood that controlling the iron supply gave them an almost incalculable military advantage. And they kept this knowledge locked within their borders with a possessiveness that bordered on paranoia. There are Hittite diplomatic letters in which foreign kings beg for iron, and the Hittite king responds with elaborate excuses about why he cannot send any right now, perhaps later, perhaps next season. Always deflecting, always delaying, never sharing. The Hittites were sitting on the most important military technology in the world, and they had no intention of letting it go. If you are lying in the dark right now, and these ancient names and places feel distant and unfamiliar, let me bring them closer. Because what I am describing is not just an ancient curiosity, it is a mirror. Think about the world today. Think about the great powers, each one with its own sphere of influence, its own military capabilities, its own technological advantages that it guards jealously. Think about the trade networks that connect to them, the diplomatic relationships that hold them together, the carefully maintained balance of power that keeps the whole system functioning. The Bronze Age world was the first version of this system, the first time humanity built something this complex, this interdependent, this powerful, and the fact that it was completely destroyed and completely forgotten should give you pause. Not fear, just pause. Just a quiet recognition that the things we build, no matter how magnificent, are not guaranteed to last. But I am getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you how it ended, I need to show you more of what existed, because the scope of this world is part of what makes its collapse so extraordinary. Turn your attention now to the western edge of this ancient network, to the shores and islands of what we now call Greece. But do not picture the Greece you might be imagining, the Greece of white marble temples and philosophers in flowing robes. That Greece, the classical Greece of Athens and Sparta and Socrates, does not exist yet. It will not exist for another 700 years. The Greece of 1200 BC is something older and in many ways more mysterious. It is Mycenaean Greece, the Greece of massive fortress palaces built from stones so large that later Greeks believed they must have been placed by giants. The Greece of gold death masks and warrior kings, and a bureaucratic sophistication that would not be matched in Europe for a millennium. The Mycenaeans are the civilization that Homer wrote about centuries later in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, who led the Greeks to Troy. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, who wandered for 10 years trying to find his way home. These are Mycenaean stories, Mycenaean heroes, Mycenaean wars. But by Homer's time, the Mycenaean world had already been destroyed and forgotten. Homer was writing about a lost age, an age of heroes that his audience believed was mythical, and for thousands of years everyone assumed Homer was just telling stories. Nobody believed that Mycenae was real, that Troy was real, that the great palace at Pylos where, according to Homer, old King Nestor entertained guests with golden cups actually existed. And then in the 19th century, archaeologists started digging, and everything changed. They found Mycenae, with its lion gate and its royal shaft graves filled with golden treasures, so magnificent that the archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann sent a telegram to the king of Greece saying he had gazed upon the face of Agamemnon. They found Troy, or at least a city in exactly the location Homer described, on the coast of Anatolia overlooking the Dardanelles, with layers of destruction suggesting it had been sacked and burned multiple times. They found the palace at Pylos, with its throne room and its frescoes and its thousands of clay tablets inscribed in a script called Linear B, which when finally deciphered in the 1950s turned out to be an early form of Greek. The Mycenaeans were real. Their world was real. And it had been destroyed so completely that for 3,000 years, even the people living in the same land had no idea it had ever existed. The Mycenaean palaces were not just royal residences. They were the centers of complex bureaucratic economies that controlled everything in their territories. The clay tablets found of Pylos are not literature or mythology. They are inventory lists, tax records, work assignments, ration distributions. They tell us how many sheep a particular shepherd was responsible for. They tell us how much bronze was allocated to each smith and what he was expected to produce. They tell us the names of individual workers and the specific tasks they were assigned. This was a command economy of remarkable precision, run from palace complexes that controlled agriculture, manufacturing, trade, and military operations across wide territories. And when these palaces were destroyed, the entire system they supported collapsed with them. The records stopped. The organization vanished. The skills and knowledge that the palace bureaucracies had maintained were lost. And Greece plunged into a dark age so profound that the inhabitants forgot how to write. For 400 years, there is virtually no written record from Greece. The lights went out, and they stayed out for centuries. If this story is making you curious, if you want to know what could possibly have destroyed a world this powerful and this interconnected, then stay with me. Because the mystery deepens with every layer we uncover. And if you are someone who finds wonder in the hidden stories of the past, do me a small kindness. Reach over, gently, without disturbing your comfort, and tap the subscribe button. Think of it as leaving a door open, so you can find your way back to stories like this whenever you need one. Now I have shown you 3 of the great powers of the Bronze Age: Egypt, the Hittites, and Mycenaean Greece. But the network was much larger than this, and to understand why its collapse was so devastating, you need to understand just how many pieces there were, and how tightly they all fit together. Travel east from Greece across the Aegean Sea, past the coast of Anatolia, and you come to the island of Cyprus, known in ancient texts as Al-Ashir. Cyprus was one of the wealthiest places in the Bronze Age world, and its wealth came from a single resource that was as strategically important then as oil is today: copper. Cyprus was the ancient world's primary source of copper, and copper was half of the recipe for bronze. Bronze, the metal that gave the entire age its name, the metal from which weapons and tools and armor and ceremonial objects were made, required two ingredients: copper and tin. Mix them together in the right proportions and you get bronze, a metal harder and more durable than either of its components alone. And while copper was available in several locations around the Mediterranean, the richest and most accessible deposits were on Cyprus. This made Cyprus indispensable. Without Cypriot copper, the Bronze Age could not function. Every sword, every spear point, every axe head, every decorative vessel, every status object that demonstrated a king's power and wealth, all of it depended on copper from this single island. But here is where it gets interesting. And this is the detail that transforms this from a story about ancient civilizations into a story about systems and vulnerability and the hidden fragility of complex networks. Copper was only half the equation. You also needed tin. And tin did not come from anywhere nearby. The nearest major tin sources were in Afghanistan, thousands of miles to the east, across deserts and mountain ranges and hostile territories. Some tin may have come from as far away as Cornwall in southwestern England, though this is debated. The point is that tin had to travel enormous distances to reach the bronze workshops of the Mediterranean, passing through multiple hands, multiple kingdoms, multiple trade networks along the way. If any link in that chain was disrupted, if any kingdom along the route fell into chaos or closed its borders, or was conquered by an enemy, the tin supply could be cut off, and without tin, there was no bronze. And without bronze, the entire technological foundation of every civilization in the region would be undermined. This is the key to understanding the Bronze Age world, and the key to understanding why it was so vulnerable. It was a system of extraordinary interdependence. No single civilization was self-sufficient. Each one depended on the others for essential resources, essential trade goods, essential diplomatic relationships. Egypt needed timber from Lebanon because Egypt had almost no forests of its own. The Hittites needed grain from Egypt because the Anatolian highlands could not always produce enough to feed their population. The Mycenaeans needed copper from Cyprus, and tin from the east, and luxury goods from everywhere, to maintain the palace economies that held their society together. Everyone needed everyone else. And this mutual dependence was both the system's greatest strength and its fatal weakness. Let me show you exactly how interconnected this world was, because there is a single piece of evidence that demonstrates it more powerfully than anything else I could describe. In 1982, a Turkish diver named Mehmet Sakir discovered a shipwreck off the coast of southwestern Turkey near a promontory called Uluburun. The wreck was excavated over 11 seasons by a team from the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, and what they found on the seafloor was nothing less than a snapshot of the entire Bronze Age world frozen in time. The ship had sunk around 1300 BC, roughly a century before the Great Collapse, and its cargo was staggering in its diversity. There were 10 tons of Cypriot copper cast into the distinctive ox-hide-shaped ingots that were the standard form for copper transport in the Bronze Age. There was a ton of tin, probably from Afghanistan, enough to combine with the copper to produce 11 tons of bronze. There were hundreds of glass ingots from Mesopotamia and Egypt. There was ebony from the heart of Africa. There was ivory, both elephant and hippopotamus. There were ostrich egg shells used as containers. There were Canaanite jars filled with resin, probably frankincense or myrrh. There was amber from the Baltic Sea, 2,000 miles to the north. There were pomegranates, figs, olives, grapes, almonds, coriander, safflower, black cumin. There were weapons, tools, and personal items from at least 7 different cultures. There was a gold scarab bearing the name of Nefertiti, the Egyptian queen. There was a folding wooden writing tablet, a Bronze Age laptop if you will, designed to hold wax on which messages could be inscribed and then erased and rewritten, a single ship, carrying goods from 7 civilizations, crossing a sea that connected worlds most people today do not even know existed. This is the Uluburun shipwreck, and it is one of the most important archaeological discoveries ever made, because it proves beyond any doubt that the Bronze Age was a globalized world. Not globalized in the way we use the word today, with container ships and air freight and fiber optic cables, but globalized in the sense that mattered, in the sense that goods and ideas and technologies and people moved across vast distances through interconnected networks that no single kingdom controlled, but every kingdom depended on. And it was all held together by bronze, by the simple fact that making the most important metal in the world required ingredients from opposite ends of the earth, and getting those ingredients to the workshops where they were combined required a system of trade and diplomacy and mutual trust that spanned the entire known world. Now, let your mind hold that image. A single ship on a blue sea, carrying the wealth of 7 nations in its hold, sailing toward a destination it will never reach. That ship is a metaphor for the entire Bronze Age. Everything in one vessel, everything connected, everything dependent on the journey being completed, and somewhere beneath the waves, a reef or a storm or a simple miscalculation waiting to send it all to the bottom. There is one more civilization I want to introduce you to before we turn to the collapse itself, and it is the one whose story haunts me the most. It is not the largest or the most powerful. It is a small city on the coast of what is now Syria, a city called Ugarit, and it matters not because of its size, but because of what it left behind. Because the last thing Ugarit ever produced was a letter that was never sent, a letter that sat in a kiln, unbaked, unfinished, while the city around it burned, and that letter is one of the most heartbreaking documents in all of human history, but I will come back to it. For now, let me tell you about Ugarit when it was alive. Ugarit was a trading city, a cosmopolitan crossroads where the cultures of the Mediterranean and the Near East met and mingled and did business. It sat on the coast of Syria, at the point where trade routes from Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Egypt and the Aegean converged. It was perfectly positioned to be the middleman of the ancient world, and it exploited that position with extraordinary skill. Ugarit was wealthy beyond its size. Its merchants traded in copper and tin, in textiles and dyes, in timber and oil and wine and grain. Its port was one of the busiest in the Mediterranean. Its population was multilingual, with people speaking and writing in Akkadian, the international diplomatic language of the day, as well as Hurrian, Hittite, Egyptian, and their own local Ugaritic language. And Ugarit's scribes did something remarkable. They developed one of the earliest alphabetic writing systems in the world. While the great empires around them used complex writing systems with hundreds of signs, cuneiform with its wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay, Egyptian hieroglyphs with their intricate pictograms, the scribes of Ugarit created a system of just 30 letters, 30 symbols that could represent all the sounds of their language. This was revolutionary. It was the ancestor, though not the direct ancestor, of the idea that would eventually produce the Phoenician alphabet, which would produce the Greek alphabet, which would produce the Latin alphabet, which would produce the letters you are reading right now. The concept of the alphabet, the idea that a small set of symbols can represent the sounds of speech, and that these symbols can be combined to write any word in any language. This idea was born in the world of Ugarit. And when Ugarit burned, the alphabet nearly died with it. Ugarit was also a vassal of the Hittite Empire, meaning it owed allegiance and tribute to the Hittite king while retaining a degree of local autonomy. This relationship was supposed to provide protection. The Hittites were the regional superpower, and their military strength was the shield behind which smaller kingdoms like Ugarit conducted their business. As long as the Hittite Empire stood, Ugarit was safe. Or so everyone believed. Now I want to introduce one more element into this picture, because without it, the story of the collapse makes no sense. I want to talk about the Amarna Letters, one of the most extraordinary collections of documents from the ancient world, and a window into the diplomatic life of the Bronze Age that reveals both its sophistication and its fragility. In 1887, a local Egyptian woman digging in the ruins of a site called Amarna, the remains of the short-lived capital built by the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, discovered a cache of clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform. She did not know what they were. She sold them to a neighbor. They passed through several hands before scholars realized what they had found. They were diplomatic letters, correspondence between the pharaohs of Egypt and the kings of every major power in the Bronze Age world. There were letters from the Hittite king, from the king of Babylon, from the king of Assyria, from the king of Mitanni, a kingdom in northern Mesopotamia that no longer existed by the time the letters were discovered, from the rulers of dozens of smaller kingdoms and city-states across the Levant. 382 letters in total, spanning roughly 30 years of diplomatic history from the mid-14th century BC. And the letters are extraordinary. They reveal a world of intricate diplomacy conducted with a mixture of formality, flattery, complaint, and barely concealed irritation that sounds remarkably modern. Kings addressed each other as brother when they considered themselves equals, and as my lord when they acknowledged a superior. They exchanged gifts with elaborate protocols. They arranged marriages between their children to seal alliances. They requested military aid, medical experts, craftsmen, and exotic animals. And they complained. Constantly. The king of Babylon wrote to the pharaoh protesting that the gold Egypt had sent was not real gold, that it had been melted down and weighed and found to be less than promised. The king of Assyria wrote complaining that he had sent the pharaoh beautiful horses and received almost nothing in return. Vassal rulers in the Levant wrote frantic letters begging for Egyptian troops to protect them from their neighbors, and the pharaoh, more often than not, did not respond. These letters show us a world held together not by shared values or common purpose, but by mutual self-interest and the constant, exhausting work of maintaining relationships. They show us kings who needed each other but did not entirely trust each other. They show us a system that functioned not because it was robust, but because everyone involved worked continuously to keep it functioning. And they show us what happens when that work stops. Because several of the letters from Levantine vassals describe deteriorating conditions, increasing threats from neighboring kingdoms or from groups described as haberu, a term whose meaning is debated but which seems to refer to displaced or stateless people living on the margins of settled society. The edges of the system were already fraying. The letters record the first whispers of the storm that was coming. If this world is beginning to feel less like ancient history and more like a reflection of something you recognize, that is not a coincidence. The parallels between the late Bronze Age world and our own are real and they are striking, and scholars have noted them repeatedly. The interconnected trade networks, the diplomatic relationships between great powers, the dependence on long-distance supply chains for essential resources, the growing inequality within societies, the pressure from displaced populations on the borders of established states, the climate shifts that stress agricultural systems, all of these features of the Bronze Age world have clear echoes in the 21st century. And the collapse of the Bronze Age, the sudden, catastrophic, almost total failure of a system that seemed unshakable, is a reminder that complexity is not the same as resilience, that a system can be both extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily fragile at the same time, that the very features that make a system impressive, its interconnectedness, its specialization, its efficiency, can be the same features that make it vulnerable to cascading failure. But we are not there yet. The collapse is still ahead, and before we get to it, I want to linger a little longer in the world that existed before, because the beauty of what was lost is an essential part of understanding the tragedy of its destruction. Let your body sink a little deeper into the mattress. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands lie open and still. The world I am describing existed 3,200 years ago, but it lives again every time someone tells its story. And tonight, in the quiet of your room, it is as real as the breath you are drawing right now. Think about what it would have been like to live in this world. Imagine yourself as a merchant in Ugarit, standing on the docks of the harbour, watching ships arrive from across the Mediterranean. A Mycenaean vessel pulls in, its hull painted with geometric patterns, carrying pottery and olive oil, and perhaps weapons bound for the Hittite frontier. Behind it, an Egyptian ship with a cargo of papyrus and linen and small blue faience amulets that are fashionable among the wealthy in every city from Thebes to Hattusa. You speak 3 languages. You can read cuneiform and your own Ugaritic alphabet. You know the going rate for a talent of copper, and you know which Cypriot merchants can be trusted and which ones will try to pass off substandard ore. You have been to Egypt yourself, travelling down the coast and then inland along the Nile to the great trading centres. You have seen the temples at Karnak, and they made you feel small. You have heard rumours of a land far to the west, beyond the sea, where people build great stone palaces and paint their walls with images of bulls and dolphins. You do not know that these are the Mycenaeans. You know them by the goods they trade and the ships they sail, and the stories that reach you third hand from sailors who have been to their ports. Your world is vast. It is connected. It is buzzing with information and goods and people moving in all directions. And it has always been this way as far as you know. Your father was a merchant. His father was a merchant. The trade routes are ancient. The diplomatic relationships are generations old. The system works. It has always worked. There is no reason to believe it will stop working. And if someone told you that within your lifetime, every kingdom you trade with, every city you have visited, every power that guarantees the safety of the sea lanes and the overland routes, all of it would be destroyed, you would not believe them. It would be like someone telling you today that within 50 years, every government on earth will collapse, every city will burn, and your grandchildren will not know how to read. It would sound absurd, impossible, the ravings of a madman. And yet it happened. Now, I have been painting a picture of stability and power, but I have been leaving something out. Underneath the surface of this magnificent world, beneath the gold and the diplomacy and the bustling trade routes, there were cracks. Small ones at first. Easy to overlook. Easy to explain away. But they were there, and they were growing, and by the time anyone noticed how serious they were, it may already have been too late. The first crack was the climate. Around 1200 BC, the weather began to change across the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. This was not a sudden catastrophe, not a single terrible storm or a volcanic winter. It was slower and more insidious than that. Rainfall patterns shifted. The rains that had sustained agriculture across the Fertile Crescent and the Anatolian highlands became less reliable. Droughts became more frequent and more severe. We know this because modern scientists have analysed pollen cores from lake beds and ocean sediments across the region, and the data tells a clear story. Around 1200 BC, the climate became drier. Significantly drier. This period is known to climatologists as the 3.2 kiloyear event, a prolonged arid phase that affected much of the northern hemisphere and lasted for centuries. For civilizations that depended on agriculture, and all of them did, this was a slow-moving disaster. A year of poor harvests could be managed. 2 years could be survived with careful rationing and grain reserves. But what happens when the drought does not end? What happens when year after year the rains fail to come? The rivers run lower, the fields produce less. What happens is famine. And famine does not just kill people. It destabilizes societies. It creates refugees, people who leave their homes in search of food and water and arable land. It breeds resentment against rulers who are supposed to provide for their people but cannot. It creates the conditions for rebellion, for civil unrest, for the collapse of the social contracts that hold complex societies together. And we have evidence that this is exactly what was happening. Hittite texts from the final decades of the empire mention grain shortages repeatedly. There are letters from the Hittite king to the pharaoh of Egypt and to the king of Ugarit requesting emergency grain shipments. Not as trade, as aid. The Hittite Empire, one of the most powerful states in the world, was running out of food. And it was not alone. Archaeological evidence from across the region shows signs of agricultural stress, of declining population, of settlements being abandoned as the people who lived in them moved on in search of better conditions. But drought alone does not destroy civilizations. Civilizations have weathered droughts before. They have stored grain, dug irrigation canals, rationed food, relocated populations. Drought is a stress, a pressure, a challenge. By itself, it is not a death sentence. For drought to become a death sentence, something else has to go wrong at the same time. And in the world of 1200 BC, something else was about to go terribly, catastrophically wrong. Several somethings, in fact, and they were all going to happen at once. I want you to hold that thought as you lie here in the gentle dark. The world is beautiful and connected and powerful, and underneath it all the ground is beginning to shift. The rains are failing, the grain stores are running low. The letters between kings are becoming more desperate, and somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, something is moving. A force that the scribes and kings of the Bronze Age will struggle to name, to understand, to describe. A force that will appear in their records as a cryptic, terrifying phrase that scholars had debated for over a century. The Sea Peoples. But who they were, where they came from, and what they wanted, that is a story that is still ahead of us, and it is more complex and more disturbing than you might expect. If this story is stirring something in you, if you can feel the weight of 3,000 years pressing gently against the edges of your mind, then you are exactly where you should be. And if you want to help other people find their way to stories like this, there is something simple you can do. Just tap the like button. That small gesture sends a signal that carries this story further into the world to people who might be lying awake right now, searching for something to carry them into sleep. Your tap is a kindness to a stranger you will never meet. And now, let us continue. The Hittite Empire was in trouble. The grain shortages were worsening. The vassal states on the empire's borders were growing restless. And the king, the great king of Hatti, the ruler of one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen, was facing a problem he could not solve with armies or diplomacy. His people were hungry. His empire was vast, stretching from the western coast of Anatolia to the borders of Assyria and deep into Syria, and maintaining control over such a large territory during a time of famine was an enormous challenge. Resources that should have been used to maintain the army and the bureaucracy were being diverted to emergency food supplies. The military was stretched thin. The empire's ability to project power was diminishing, and at exactly this moment the Hittites faced a threat from an unexpected direction. Texts from the final years of the empire mention attacks by groups coming from the sea, landing on the southern coast of Anatolia, and raiding cities that had been under Hittite protection. These were not the first maritime raids in the Mediterranean. Piracy had existed for as long as there had been ships, but these attacks were different in scale and persistence. They were not hit-and-run raids by small bands of pirates. They were large-scale assaults by organized groups, and they were happening with increasing frequency. The Hittites scrambled to respond, pulling troops from other fronts to defend the coast, weakening their positions elsewhere. And, in the confusion, in the stretching thin of resources and attention, the internal cohesion of the empire began to fracture. What happened next at Hattusa, the great Hittite capital, remains one of the most enigmatic events in ancient history. The city was destroyed, burned, but the circumstances of its destruction are deeply puzzling. When archaeologists excavated Hattusa, they found evidence of a massive fire that had consumed large portions of the city. The administrative buildings, the temples, the royal palace, all had been burned. But they also found something strange. Or rather, they did not find something. The city appeared to have been evacuated before it was destroyed. The royal archives, the thousands of clay tablets that recorded the empire's treaties, its diplomatic correspondence, its religious texts and administrative records, many of these were found in orderly condition as if they had been left in place rather than scattered by invaders. Personal valuables were largely absent. The city's population seemed to have packed up and left before the destruction occurred. Some scholars believe the Hittites themselves burned Hattusa as they abandoned it, destroying what they could not take with them rather than leaving it for an approaching enemy. Others believe the city was taken and burned by invaders after the population fled. The truth is that nobody knows for certain. What is certain is that Hattusa was destroyed around 1200 BC, and the Hittite Empire, which had stood for over 4 centuries, ceased to exist. It did not decline gradually. It did not transform into a successor state. It vanished, and it vanished so completely that within a few generations nobody remembered it had existed. For 3,000 years, the Hittites were a blank space in the human story, unknown to anyone until archaeologists began to unearth their ruins in the 19th century. Let that sink in for a moment. An empire that rivaled Egypt in power and sophistication. An empire that signed the world's first known peace treaty. An empire that held the secret of iron smelting. An empire with a written legal code and a sophisticated religious tradition and a diplomatic network that spanned the ancient world. This empire was so thoroughly destroyed that humanity forgot it existed for 3,000 years. That is the scale of what happened in 1200 BC. That is the depth of the forgetting. And the Hittites were not alone. They were just the first to fall. The night is deepening around you now. The story is deepening too. And as you lie here, breathing slowly, feeling the gentle pull of sleep at the edges of your consciousness, the ancient world is holding its breath. The drought is worsening. The Hittites have fallen. The trade networks that sustain the entire system are beginning to fray, and out on the dark Mediterranean, ships are gathering. Ships carrying warriors and families and ox carts and everything a people owns when they have no home and nowhere to go. The sea peoples are coming, and the world they are sailing toward will never be the same. But that is a story for the next part of our journey. For now, let the images settle behind your eyes. The great temples of Egypt bathed in golden light. The massive walls of Hattusa standing empty against a grey sky. The merchant ships of Ugarit crossing a blue sea that does not know what is coming. The Uluburun ship, resting on the seafloor with the wealth of 7 civilizations in its hold. A perfect miniature of a world that was about to end. Hold these images gently. They are not yours to carry. They are simply passing through, like clouds across a dark sky, and you can watch them drift by without holding on to any of them. The story will be here when you return. Stories always are, especially the ones that were almost lost. There is a wall in Egypt that tells a story no one fully understands. It is not hidden. It is not buried. It stands in plain sight at a place called Medinet Habu, on the west bank of the Nile near the modern city of Luxor, and it is part of the mortuary temple of a pharaoh named Ramses III. The wall is covered in carved relief scenes, enormous figures of warriors and ships and fallen enemies, accompanied by hieroglyphic inscriptions that describe what the pharaoh claimed was the greatest military victory in Egyptian history. And the enemy he defeated, the force he claims to have turned back from the very gates of Egypt, is described in terms that have baffled historians for over a century. The inscriptions do not name a single nation or a single king. They describe a coalition, a confederation of peoples who came from somewhere across the sea, who moved not just as armies but as entire populations, men and women and children with ox carts loaded with possessions, travelling by land and by sea simultaneously, sweeping down through the eastern Mediterranean like a wave, destroying everything in their path. The Hittites fell before them. The cities of the Levantine coast burned. The kingdoms of Cyprus and western Anatolia were overrun, and then they reached Egypt, and Ramses III, according to his own account, stopped them. The inscriptions call them by names: the Peliset, the Chika, the Shikalish, the Janayan, the Weshesh. These names appear in Egyptian records and almost nowhere else. And for more than 100 years, scholars have argued about who these people were, where they came from, and whether the Egyptian account is even accurate. Some of the names seem to correspond to known places or peoples. The Peliset are often identified with the Philistines, the people who would later settle along the southern coast of the Levant and give their name to Palestine. The Shekelish might be connected to Sicily. The Danaan might be the Danaans, one of Homer's names for the Greeks. The Cheka might be from the region of Troy, but these identifications are uncertain, debated, and in some cases probably wrong. The truth is that we do not know who the Sea Peoples were. We do not know where they came from. We do not know if they were a single coordinated force or multiple unrelated groups who happened to be moving at the same time. And we do not know what set them in motion. Let that uncertainty settle over you like a soft blanket. In a world that prizes answers, that demands explanations, that insists on knowing why, there is something almost restful about a mystery that has resisted solution for over a century. Not every question has an answer. Not every story has a neat ending. And the story of the Sea Peoples is one of those stories. A thread that you can follow deep into the labyrinth of the past without ever reaching the center. But the journey through the labyrinth is worth taking, because what you find along the way illuminates not just the ancient world, but the nature of collapse itself. Let your shoulders drop a little further. Let the muscles around your eyes soften. The story is carrying you now, and you do not need to hold on to every detail. Let the parts that interest you linger, and let the rest flow past like water in a slow river. Now, the traditional narrative, the one you will find in older textbooks and popular histories, goes something like this. The Sea Peoples were invaders. They came from somewhere in the Western Mediterranean or the Aegean. They formed a massive coalition, and they swept through the Eastern Mediterranean, destroying everything they encountered. They were the cause of the Bronze Age collapse. They were the barbarians at the gate, the external shock that brought down the civilized world. End of story. But this narrative has problems, serious problems, and the more carefully scholars have examined the evidence, the more those problems have multiplied until the neat story of invasion and destruction has become something far more complicated and far more interesting. The first problem is scale. The Sea Peoples, however numerous they were, could not have single-handedly destroyed every civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire alone had an army of tens of thousands. Egypt's military was even larger. The Mycenaean kingdoms were fortress states with professional warriors. These were not defenseless societies waiting to be conquered by a band of raiders. For the Sea Peoples to have destroyed all of them, they would have needed a military force larger than anything the ancient world had ever seen, and there is no evidence of any such force. The Sea Peoples were real. They did attack. They did cause damage. But attributing the entire collapse to them is like attributing a building collapse to the last gust of wind that knocked it over. The wind was real, but the building was already crumbling. The second problem is direction. If the Sea Peoples were the cause of the collapse, then the destruction should radiate outward from wherever they originated, following their path of conquest. But the pattern of destruction in the archaeological record does not follow a neat path. Some cities were destroyed that were not on any logical invasion route. Some cities that were directly in the path of any plausible Sea Peoples movement were not destroyed at all, or were destroyed at different times that do not match a single coordinated campaign. The destruction was not a line drawn across a map. It was scattered, inconsistent, and spread over decades. This does not look like a coordinated invasion. It looks like something else entirely. The third problem, and this is the one that I find most fascinating, is that the Sea Peoples themselves may have been victims of the collapse rather than its cause. Think about it. What makes an entire people leave their homeland? What makes families pack their possessions onto ox carts and onto ships and set out across the sea toward an unknown destination? Not conquest. Conquest is what armies do, and armies travel light. The Sea Peoples brought their families. They brought their children. They brought everything they owned. That is not the behavior of conquerors. That is the behavior of refugees. People who have been driven from their homes by forces they cannot control. People whose world has already collapsed, who are fleeing the wreckage and desperately searching for somewhere new to live. If this is true, and many modern scholars believe it is at least partially true, then the Sea Peoples were not the cause of the collapse. They were a symptom of it. They were people displaced by the same forces that were destroying everything else. Drought, famine, economic disruption, social upheaval, and their migration. Their desperate search for survival became another force of destruction layered on top of everything else. The victims became agents of further victimization. The refugees became destroyers, not because they wanted to destroy, but because a world in collapse leaves no room for gentle arrivals. When everything is burning, there is no empty land to settle peacefully. There are only territories held by people who are themselves desperate and afraid and willing to fight to keep what little they have left. This reframing of the Sea Peoples from invaders to refugees, from cause to symptom, changes the entire story of the Bronze Age collapse. It transforms it from a simple narrative of external destruction into something far more complex and far more unsettling. Because if the Sea Peoples were not the cause, then what was? And the answer, the honest answer, is that there was no single cause. There was a cascade, a series of interconnected failures, each one making the others worse, each one pushing the system closer to the edge, until the edge gave way and everything fell at once. This is what scholars call systems collapse. and this is the leading modern explanation for what happened at the end of the Bronze Age. And understanding it requires thinking about the ancient world not as a collection of separate civilizations, but as a single complex system, a network of interdependent parts that functioned together as a whole. Because that is what the Bronze Age world was, not 6 or 8 or 10 independent kingdoms that happened to exist at the same time. It was one system, one interconnected web, and when it failed as a system, not in pieces, all at once. Imagine a table standing on 6 legs. Each leg is a different factor supporting the stability of the Bronze Age world. One leg is climate stability. One leg is agricultural production. One leg is the trade network. One leg is diplomatic relationships between the great powers. One leg is internal social cohesion within each kingdom. And one leg is military security. Now imagine that the climate leg is weakened by drought. The table wobbles but stays up. Then the agricultural leg is weakened by the famines that follow the drought. The table wobbles more. Then the trade leg is disrupted, as kingdoms that are dealing with famine and internal unrest can no longer maintain the trade routes. The table is now very unsteady. Then displaced populations, the sea peoples among them, begin moving through the system, weakening the military security leg. Then the internal social cohesion leg cracks, as hungry, frightened populations lose faith in their rulers. And then, finally, the diplomatic relationships that held the great powers together begin to fail as each kingdom turns inward, focusing on its own survival, unable or unwilling to send aid to allies in distress. And the table falls, not because any one leg was removed, because all of them were weakened at the same time and the combined stress exceeded the system's ability to absorb it. This is systems collapse, and it is terrifying precisely because it has no single cause, no single villain, no single moment where someone could have made a different choice and prevented the catastrophe. It is the emergent result of multiple failures interacting in ways that no one could have predicted or controlled. And the reason it is relevant today, the reason scholars like Eric Klein have drawn explicit parallels between the Bronze Age collapse and the modern world, is that our world is also a complex interconnected system. Our world also depends on long-distance trade, on international diplomacy, on climate stability, on social cohesion, on all the same legs that supported the Bronze Age table. And our world, like theirs, is experiencing stress on multiple legs simultaneously. But I do not want to dwell on modern parallels tonight. Tonight is for the ancient world, for the story of what happened and the people who lived through it. And there is one story from the collapse that I had been holding in reserve, one story that captures the human reality of this catastrophe more powerfully than any theory or analysis. It is the story of Ugarit's last hours, and it is one of the most haunting stories in all of archaeology. If you have been with me from the beginning of this journey and these stories are giving you something, wonder or comfort or simply a companion for the quiet hours, then I want you to know that sharing this story with someone matters. A friend who cannot sleep, a family member who loves history, someone who might need the sound of a voice in the dark, telling them that the world is old and strange and full of stories worth knowing. Send them here. That small act of sharing is how stories survive. It is how they have always survived, since the very first storyteller sat beside the very first fire. Now, Ugarit. The city had stood for centuries. It had weathered wars, plagues, earthquakes, droughts. It had survived because it was useful, because its position on the coast made it indispensable to the trade network, because its merchants were skilled and its diplomats were clever, and its alliance with the Hittite Empire provided a security guarantee that no rational enemy would test. But by approximately 1185 BC, every one of these protections had failed. The Hittite Empire was gone. Hattusa had burned. The great king who was supposed to protect Ugarit no longer existed. The security guarantee that had shielded the city for generations was now meaningless, a promise made by a ghost. The trade network that had made Ugarit wealthy was collapsing. Ships that once sailed regular routes between Cyprus and Egypt and the Aegean were no longer coming. The markets that had sustained the city's economy were drying up as fast as the rain-starved fields in the interior, and something was approaching from the sea. Reports were coming in of attacks on coastal cities to the north and south. Fleets of unknown origin were raiding and burning settlements along the shore. Ugarit's king, a man named Amarapi, was desperately trying to organize a defense, but his resources were stretched beyond breaking. He had sent his army north to the Hittite frontier before he realized the Hittites were gone. He had sent his fleet to the coast of Lycia in southwestern Anatolia to help defend against raiders before he realized the raiders were coming for him. We know all of this because of the letters. Ugarit's scribes were meticulous record keepers, and the city's archives, baked and preserved by the very fire that destroyed them, contain correspondence from the city's final days that reads like a slow-motion disaster. There is a letter from the king of Alatia, Cyprus, to Amarapi, warning him of enemy ships that have been sighted at sea. There is Amarapi's response, and it is frantic. He writes that his troops are in the Hittite land. His ships are in the land of Lucca. The country, he says, is abandoned to itself. He begs for help. He begs for whatever forces Cyprus can send. He begs for ships, for soldiers, for anything. And then there is the last letter, the letter that was found at a kiln, unbaked, never sent. It is from Amarapi, and it is addressed to the king of Alatia, and it says that the enemy ships have arrived, that they have already attacked, that the cities are burning. The letter begs for help one more time, but you can feel the desperation in the words shifting into something else, something closer to resignation. The letter was placed in the kiln to be baked, to be hardened so that it could survive the journey to Cyprus. But the kiln was never fired. The letter was never sent. The city burned around it, and the fire that destroyed Ugarit baked the letter into permanence, preserving it for 3,200 years, a final message in a bottle from a world that was disappearing. Ugarit was never rebuilt, never reoccupied. The site was abandoned after its destruction and remained empty, slowly buried by wind-blown soil and vegetation until French archaeologists began excavating it in 1929. The city that had been one of the most important trading centers in the ancient world, the city where the alphabet was born, the city that had connected civilizations from Egypt to Greece to Mesopotamia, was erased from history as completely as if it had never existed. For 3,000 years it lay in the earth, silent, forgotten, holding in its ruins the unbaked letter of a king who ran out of time. Let that story rest in your mind like a stone dropped into still water. Let the ripples spread and fade. You do not need to hold the sadness of it. It is 3,000 years old. The grief has long since passed. What remains is the story, and stories are not sad in the way that events are sad. Stories are containers. They hold the past without being weighed down by it. And tonight, this story is holding you as much as you are holding it. Now, the fall of Ugarit was not an isolated event. It was one moment in a cascade of destruction that swept across the eastern Mediterranean over the course of roughly 50 years, from around 1200 to 1150 BC, and the breadth of that destruction is almost impossible to overstate. To the south of Ugarit, along the Levantine coast, city after city was destroyed. The great Canaanite centers that had thrived under Egyptian protection were burned and abandoned. Hazor, one of the largest cities in the region, was destroyed so thoroughly that the upper city was never rebuilt. The destruction layer at Hazor is one of the most dramatic in all of Near Eastern archaeology. A thick band of ash and collapsed mud brick and shattered pottery marking the end of a city that had stood for centuries. Who destroyed it remains debated. Some scholars blame the Sea peoples. Others suggest it was destroyed by the Israelites, whose own origin story, recorded in the Bible centuries later, claims that Joshua conquered and burned Hazor. Others propose internal revolt, an uprising of the lower classes against the palatial elite. The truth, as with so much of this period, is that we simply do not know. Further south, in Egypt, the story was different but equally dramatic. Egypt did not fall, not entirely, but it came closer than most people realize, and the battle that saved it, the battle depicted on the walls at Medinet Habu, was one of the most significant military engagements in ancient history, though it is far less famous than it deserves to be. Ramses III was not the equal of his namesake, Ramses II, He was a capable pharaoh, but he ruled a diminished Egypt. The glory days of the new kingdom were already fading. The treasury was under strain. The workforce was restless. In fact, during the reign of Ramses III, something happened at the village of Deir el-Medina, on the west bank of the Nile, that had never happened before in recorded history. The workers went on strike. These were the men who built and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, and they were employed directly by the state. They received their wages in the form of grain, oil, and other necessities, and when those wages stopped coming, when the bureaucratic system that was supposed to feed them broke down, they stopped working. They sat down. They refused to enter the tombs. They marched on the local administrative offices and demanded what they were owed. This is the first recorded labor strike in human history, and it happened not in a failing state, but in the most powerful kingdom in the world. The grain was not coming. The system was faltering, and the people at the bottom of the hierarchy were the first to feel it. It was into this already stressed Egypt that the Sea Peoples came. Ramses III's inscriptions describe a two-pronged attack, a land force moving down through the Levant toward the Egyptian border in Syria, and a naval force approaching by sea, heading for the Nile Delta. The land force travelled with families and ox carts, confirming that this was not simply a military campaign but a mass migration. The people coming toward Egypt were not trying to raid it. They were trying to settle in it. They were looking for a new home, and they had chosen the richest, most fertile land in the region, the Nile Valley. Ramses met the land force somewhere in the northern Levant and appears to have defeated or deflected it. But the real crisis came at sea. The Egyptian navy was not traditionally the strongest branch of its military. Egypt was a land power, a river power, and the open sea was not its natural domain. But Ramses prepared. He positioned his fleet in one of the mouths of the Nile Delta and waited. And when the Sea People's ships entered the shallow coastal waters, Ramses sprang his trap. Archers stationed on the shore rained arrows on the enemy fleet. Egyptian ships engaged at close quarters in the narrow channels of the delta, where the larger, deeper-drafted vessels of the Sea Peoples could not maneuver effectively. The relief at Medinet Habu shows the battle in vivid detail. Egyptian archers standing tall and composed while enemy warriors topple from their ships into the water, their vessels capsizing, their bodies pierced by arrows. It is, of course, propaganda. The pharaoh's temple was not going to depict a close-run thing or a Pyrrhic victory. But beneath the propaganda, the basic story appears to be true. Ramses defeated the Sea Peoples at the Battle of the Delta, and Egypt survived. But survival is not the same as triumph. Egypt, after the Sea Peoples, was not the Egypt before them. The new kingdom limped on for another century or so, but it was a shadow of what it had been. The trade networks that had sustained Egyptian wealth were gone. The Levantine territories that Egypt had controlled were lost. The flow of tribute from vassal states dried up. The pharaohs who followed Ramses III were weak, their reigns short, their power increasingly challenged by the priests of Amun at Thebes, who eventually became powerful enough to effectively split the country in two. By around 1070 BC, the new kingdom was over. Egypt entered its third intermediate period, an era of division and decline that lasted for centuries. The pyramids still stood, of course. The Nile still flooded. But the civilization that had produced Ramses the Great and Hatshepsut and Tutankhamun was finished, and the Egypt that eventually emerged from the collapse was a fundamentally different place. Never again the dominant power it had been during the Bronze Age. Now, while Egypt was fighting for survival at the Nile Delta, something equally catastrophic was happening on the other side of the Mediterranean, in Greece. And what happened to the Mycenaean world is, in some ways, the most disturbing collapse of all. Because the Mycenaeans did not just lose their cities, they lost their minds. Or rather, they lost their writing, which in a literate civilization amounts to much the same thing. The destruction of the Mycenaean palace centers happened over a period of decades, roughly between 1200 and 1100 BC. The great fortress palace at Pylos was one of the first to fall. The archaeological evidence is dramatic. The palace was burned in a massive fire, the heat so intense that it baked the clay tablets stored in the archive rooms, accidentally preserving the administrative records that the scribes had been maintaining right up until the moment of destruction. Those tablets, written in Linear B, tell us what the palace was doing in its final days, and the picture they paint is chilling. The tablets from Pylos' last months show a kingdom preparing for an attack. There are records of bronze being collected from temples, a desperate measure suggesting that the normal supply of bronze had been cut off, and the kingdom was melting down sacred objects to make weapons. There are records of rowers being assigned to ships, of watchers being posted along the coast, of military forces being reorganized and redeployed. The kingdom of Pylos knew something was coming. It was trying to prepare. And it failed. The palace was destroyed, the surrounding settlements were abandoned, and the entire administrative system that had organized life across the region ceased to exist. Mycenae itself, the great citadel with its lion gate and its royal tombs, survived longer than Pylos but did not escape unscathed. It was damaged, possibly by earthquake, possibly by attack, around 1200 BC, partially rebuilt and then destroyed again around 1100 BC. By the time the dust settled, the Mycenaean world was gone. Not transformed, not evolved into something new. Gone. The palaces were empty. The bureaucracies that had managed agriculture and trade and labor and military operations were dissolved. The scribes who had written in Linear B were dead or scattered, and there was no longer any institution that needed their skills. Writing disappeared from Greece. For roughly 400 years, the Greeks did not write, could not write, had no writing system. The knowledge of Linear B was lost completely and would not be recovered until the 20th century, when a young English architect named Michael Ventris deciphered it in 1952, 25 centuries after the last scribe had pressed a stylus into wet clay. Think about what this means. The Greeks, who would eventually produce Homer and Sophocles and Plato and Aristotle, who would invent democracy and philosophy and theatre and the foundations of Western science, these people forgot how to write for 400 years. The Dark Age that followed the Mycenaean collapse was not a metaphorical darkness, it was a literal one. The lights of literacy went out, and the stories of the Mycenaean world passed into oral tradition, becoming legends, becoming myths, becoming the tales of heroes and gods that Homer would eventually weave into the Iliad and the Odyssey, not realizing, or perhaps realizing perfectly well, that he was telling the stories of a real world that had been real cities and real kings and real wars, all of it buried under centuries of forgetting. And this is the part that always strikes me with the greatest force. The forgetting. Not the destruction, because destruction is dramatic and comprehensible and in some ways expected. Empires rise and fall, cities burn, kingdoms are conquered. This is the rhythm of history, and while it is tragic, it is not surprising. But the forgetting, the complete erasure of an entire world from human memory, that is something else. That is not just loss. That is annihilation. The Hittites did not just fall, they were forgotten so thoroughly that when 19th century scholars began to find references to them in Egyptian and Assyrian texts, they did not know what they were reading. The word Hatti appeared in inscriptions, and scholars debated for decades what it referred to. An unknown city? A minor tribe? It took years of excavation and decipherment to realize that Hatti was an empire, a great power, a civilization that had stood toe-to-toe with Egypt for centuries, and it had been erased from the record so completely that recovering it felt like discovering an entirely new chapter of human history that nobody knew existed. The same is true, to varying degrees, of the other civilizations that fell. The Mycenaeans survived in myth but not in memory. The stories of Agamemnon and Odysseus and the Trojan War persisted, but they were understood as legends, not as history. The idea that there had been a real civilization in Greece before classical Greece, a civilization with palaces and writing and international trade, was considered absurd until the excavations proved otherwise. Ugarit was completely unknown until 1929. The international system that had connected all these civilizations, the world of the Amarna Letters and the Uluburun ship and the Great King's Club, was invisible to history for 3,000 years. If you have been listening to this story and feeling something, a sense of wonder or unease or simply curiosity about what happened next and why, then you are responding to the story the way it deserves to be responded to. This is not just ancient history. This is a mirror. and the reflection it shows is uncomfortable precisely because it is familiar. Let your breathing be slow and even now. Let each exhale carry a little more tension out of your body. The story has been intense, I know. Burning cities and desperate letters and civilizations vanishing into the dark. But the darkness of the story is not the same as the darkness of your room. Your room is safe. Your bed is warm. The world outside your window, whatever its problems, is still turning, still functioning, still holding together. And the story I am telling you is not a prophecy. It is a record of what happened once, long ago, to a world that was not prepared for the forces that were about to hit it. And records are useful precisely because they help us understand what to prepare for. Now, I want to pull back from the individual civilizations and look at the collapse as a whole, because there is a pattern to it that is only visible from a distance. The way a mosaic is just scattered stones when you stand too close, but becomes a picture when you step back. The collapse of the Bronze Age was not a single event. It was a process, a cascade, a chain reaction that played out over roughly 50 years. And the order in which things fell tells us something important about the structure of the system and the nature of its failure. The periphery fell first. The outlying regions, the smaller kingdoms, the less powerful states, these were the first to go. Cities on the coast of Anatolia were raided and burned. Small kingdoms in the Levant lost their Egyptian protection and were overrun. The Hittite vassal states in Syria fragmented as the Hittite Empire weakened. The edges of the system frayed before the center gave way. Then the great powers began to fail. The Hittites first, then the Mycenaeans, then the Egyptians in their diminished, survival mode form. The sequence makes sense when you think about it geographically and strategically. The Hittites were the most vulnerable because they were the most dependent on long-distance trade for basic necessities like grain. The Mycenaeans were next because their palace economies were rigid and centralized and could not adapt to the loss of international trade. Egypt survived longest because it had the Nile, the most reliable agricultural system in the ancient world, a river that flooded predictably every year and deposited rich silt on its banks regardless of what was happening to rainfall elsewhere. But even the Nile could not protect Egypt from the cumulative effect of losing its trade partners, its vassal states, its military dominance, and its internal cohesion. And the final stage of the collapse was the Dark Age that followed. The centuries of reduced population, lost knowledge, abandoned settlements, and cultural simplicity that descended over the entire region. This Dark Age was not uniform. Some areas recovered faster than others. Some areas maintained continuity with the Bronze Age world, preserving fragments of knowledge and tradition that would eventually re-emerge. But the overall picture is one of dramatic decline, a world that went from palaces and international diplomacy to scattered villages and subsistence farming in the space of a few generations. There is one more factor in the collapse that I'd not yet discussed, and it is one that is easy to overlook but may have been critically important. Earthquakes. The Eastern Mediterranean sits on some of the most tectonically active zones in the world, and there is growing evidence that a series of major earthquakes, what some geologists call an earthquake storm, struck the region during the critical period around 1200 BC. Archaeological evidence of earthquake damage has been found at multiple sites that were destroyed during the collapse, including Mycenae, Tiryns, Mydia in Greece, and several sites in Anatolia and the Levant. The pattern of destruction at some of these sites, walls toppled in specific directions, buildings collapsed in ways consistent with seismic shock rather than fire or warfare, suggests that earthquakes played a role in their destruction. And an earthquake storm, a sequence of major seismic events occurring over decades along connected fault lines, could have devastated the region's infrastructure at precisely the moment when the civilizations were least able to absorb the damage. But like every other proposed cause, earthquakes alone cannot explain the collapse. Civilizations in earthquake-prone regions rebuild after earthquakes all the time. Japan, Turkey, Iran, California, these places experience devastating earthquakes regularly and recover. The difference is that they recover because their broader systems are intact. They have resources, they have allies, they have functioning governments and economies that can mobilize recovery efforts. The Bronze Age civilizations that were hit by earthquakes in 1200 BC did not have these advantages because everything else was failing at the same time. The trade networks were collapsing. The grain was running out. The sea peoples were on the move. The diplomatic relationships that might have brought aid were dissolving. An earthquake that would have been a setback in normal times became a catastrophe because there was no resilience left in the system to absorb it. And this is the lesson. This is the thing that makes the Bronze Age collapse relevant to anyone who cares about the present and the future. It is not that any single threat is insurmountable. Drought can be managed. Earthquakes can be survived. Migrations can be absorbed. Trade disruptions can be adapted to. Each of these challenges, taken individually, is something that human civilizations have faced and overcome many times throughout history. The danger is not any single threat. The danger is all of them at once. The danger is the cascade, the feedback loop, the chain reaction in which each failure amplifies the others, until the system cannot absorb any more shocks and the whole thing comes apart. The Bronze Age world was not destroyed by the sea peoples or by droughts or by earthquakes or by internal rebellion or by trade disruption. It was destroyed by all of them, acting together, reinforcing each other, creating a perfect storm of cascading failure that no single civilization and no alliance of civilizations could withstand. It was destroyed by complexity itself, by the very interconnectedness that had made it so powerful and so prosperous. The web that held everything together became the mechanism of its unraveling, because when one strand broke, it transferred stress to the adjacent strands, which broke in turn, transferring stress to more strands, until the whole web gave way. If you are still with me, still floating in the space between wakefulness and sleep, I want you to know that the story is not over. There is still a chapter to come, a chapter about what emerged from the ashes, about what the world looked like after the collapse, and how humanity rebuilt from the rubble. Because the Bronze Age collapse is not just a story of destruction, it is also, surprisingly, a story of creation. Some of the most important innovations in human history, the alphabet, iron technology, democracy, monotheism, emerged not from the glory of the Bronze Age, but from the darkness that followed its fall. The collapse destroyed a world, but it also cleared the ground for something new, and that something new would eventually become the foundation of the world we live in today. But that chapter is ahead of us. For now, let the weight of the story settle into you, the way sediment settles to the bottom of a still pool. The water above is clear, the thoughts are there, but they are quiet. The ancient cities are sleeping in their ruins, and you are sleeping in your bed, and the distance between you is 3,000 years and no distance at all, because the story connects you. The same sky that watched the fires at Ugarit is watching over you tonight, and the stars have not changed, and the questions that the last king of Ugarit asked in his unbaked letter are the same questions that every person in every civilization has asked when the world begins to shake. Will help come? Will we survive? Will anyone remember us? The help did not come for Ugarit, but someone did remember. 3,200 years later, someone dug the letter out of the ashes and read it and understood what it meant. And tonight, you heard it too. The letter was finally delivered, 3,200 years late, but delivered. And the story it tells is still alive, still speaking, still asking its questions in the dark. The earthquake that hit the city of Tiryns was not like anything the people living there had experienced before. Tiryns was a Mycenaean fortress, a palace complex built on a low hill in the northeastern Peloponnese, surrounded by walls so thick and so massive that the later Greeks, who had no memory of who built them, called them Cyclopean walls, believing that only the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants of mythology, could have moved stones that large. Each block weighed several tons. The walls were 40 feet thick in places. Tiryns was a place designed to be unbreakable, a fortress that could withstand any siege, any assault, any force that human enemies could bring against it. But an earthquake is not a human enemy. An earthquake does not care about walls. And when the earth beneath Tiryns shifted, sometime around 1200 BC, those massive Cyclopean walls cracked and buckled, and in places collapsed. The giant stones that had stood for centuries tumbling like children's blocks pushed over by a careless hand. The archaeological evidence at Tiryns tells a complex story. The earthquake damage is clear. Walls displaced in ways that only seismic force can explain. Floors buckled and split by the movement of the ground beneath them. But the earthquake did not destroy Tiryns completely. The people who lived there attempted to rebuild. They patched the walls. They repaired the palace. They tried to restore the administrative system that had managed the surrounding territory. And for a while, it seemed like they might succeed. Tiryns continued to function in a diminished form for several decades after the initial earthquake damage. But the world around it was falling apart. The trade networks that had supplied the palace with copper and tin and luxury goods from abroad were collapsing. The other Mycenaean centers were being destroyed or abandoned one by one. The system that Tiryns depended on, the interconnected web of palace economies and international trade and diplomatic relationships, was disintegrating. And in the end, the earthquake did not destroy Tiryns alone. The earthquake weakened it, and then everything else finished the job. This pattern, weakening followed by finishing, stress followed by collapse, repeated itself across the entire Bronze Age world with an almost mechanical regularity. No single blow was fatal. Every single blow was compounded by every other blow, and together they were unsurvivable. It is the pattern of a system failing, not the pattern of a conquest or a natural disaster. And recognizing this pattern is essential to understanding what happened and why it matters. Let your body continue to settle. Feel the weight of your limbs against the bed. Notice how your breathing has found its own rhythm, slow and steady without you needing to manage it. The story is doing its work, carrying you deeper into the quiet place where sleep begins, and you do not need to resist or assist. Just listen and let the ancient world hold you the way the earth holds the ruins of the civilizations we have been discussing, gently, patiently, without judgment. I want to take you now to a place we have not yet visited, a place that adds another dimension to this story and reveals something about the collapse that is easy to miss when you focus only on the great powers. I want to talk about the ordinary people, the farmers and craftsmen and laborers and herders who made up the vast majority of the Bronze Age population and whose experiences of the collapse were very different from those of the kings and generals whose names appear in the inscriptions. The palace economies of the Bronze Age were top-down systems. The palace controlled everything. It collected agricultural surplus from the farmers, it distributed raw materials to the craftsmen and told them what to produce. It organized labor for construction projects and military campaigns. It stored grain and redistributed it during lean times. It managed trade with other kingdoms. In exchange for all of this control, the palace provided security, organization, and a functioning economy. The farmers grew their crops and gave a portion to the palace. The craftsmen produced their goods and gave them to the palace. The palace in turn provided for everyone, allocating rations, assigning work, maintaining order. It was a system that worked remarkably well as long as the palace functioned. And it was a system that collapsed utterly and completely when the palace stopped functioning. Because when the palace at Pylos burned, the farmers in the surrounding territory did not just lose their king. They lost the entire organizational structure of their lives. There was no one to collect the grain and redistribute it, no one to manage the irrigation systems, no one to organize defense against raiders, no one to maintain the roads or the bridges or the harvesting facilities that connected the region to the wider world. The palace had been the brain of the system, and when the brain died, the body could not function. Individual farmers could still farm. Individual craftsmen could still craft. But the network that connected them, that organized them, that turned their individual efforts into a functioning society, was gone. This is why the Dark Age that followed the Bronze Age collapse was so severe and so prolonged. It was not just that cities were destroyed. It was that the organizational knowledge, the institutional memory, the administrative expertise that had made complex society possible was lost. You can rebuild a wall. You can replant a field. But you cannot easily recreate a bureaucratic system from scratch when the people who understood how it worked are dead or scattered and the records they kept have been burned. The collapse was not just material. It was cognitive. It was a loss of knowledge, of know-how, of the accumulated institutional wisdom that had taken centuries to develop. And recovering that knowledge would take centuries more. Think about what this meant for an ordinary person living through the collapse. Imagine yourself as a farmer in the Peloponnese around 1150 BC. Your grandfather served the palace at Mycenae. He delivered his grain to the palace stores every harvest. He received his allotment of oil and wine and textiles in return. He knew his place in the system, and the system, however demanding, provided a framework for his life. Your father grew up in a world where the system was already fraying. The grain deliveries to the palace became irregular. The allotments from the palace became smaller. Rumors reached the village about attacks on coastal settlements, about kingdoms falling in distant lands. Your father worried, but the walls of Mycenae were still standing, and the king was still on his throne, and surely the system would hold. And then the system did not hold. The palace burned. The king vanished or was killed. The administrators who had managed the economy fled or died. The trade routes that had brought copper and tin for tools and weapons went silent. The roads that had connected your village to the wider world became dangerous, haunted by bandits and displaced people and the remnants of armies with nowhere to go. And suddenly you are alone. Your village is alone. There is no higher authority to appeal to, no network to draw on, no system to provide what you cannot provide for yourself. You still have your land. You still have your skills. But the world has contracted to the boundaries of what you can see from your doorstep, and beyond that boundary there is only uncertainty. This was the reality of the Greek Dark Ages. Populations dropped dramatically. Settlements shrank from towns to villages, from villages to hamlets. Long-distance trade virtually ceased. Artistic production declined in quality and quantity. Monumental architecture stopped completely. And writing disappeared because writing was a technology of administration, and there was no longer anything to administer. The linear B script that the Mycenaean scribes had used to record inventories and tax assessments and work assignments was forgotten within a generation, because nobody needed it anymore. There were no inventories to keep, no taxes to assess, no work to assign. The skill of writing, which had taken centuries to develop, evaporated in decades because the social infrastructure that required it no longer existed. There is something deeply sobering about this. We tend to think of knowledge as permanent, as something that, once learned, cannot be unlearned. But knowledge exists in systems, not in isolation. A single scribe who knows linear B is useless without a palace that needs records kept. A single metal worker who knows how to alloy bronze is useless without a supply chain that delivers copper and tin to his workshop. A single ship captain who knows the sea routes to Egypt is useless without ports that will receive him and markets that will buy his cargo. Knowledge is not just information, it is information embedded in a functioning system. And when the system fails, the knowledge fails with it. Not because it is forgotten in some abstract sense, but because there is no longer any context in which it can be used or transmitted or preserved. This is why the recovery from the Bronze Age collapse took so long. It was not just a matter of rebuilding walls and replanting fields. It was a matter of reinventing the systems that made complex society possible, and that process of reinvention took centuries. The Greeks did not simply pick up where the Mycenaeans left off, they started over. They built a new civilization from the ground up, with new institutions, new forms of government, new writing systems, new ways of organizing society. And the civilization they built, classical Greece, was in many ways radically different from the Mycenaean world that had preceded it. It was as if the collapse had wiped the slate clean, erasing not just the physical infrastructure of the old world, but the mental models, the assumptions, the ways of thinking that had shaped it. And from that blank slate, something entirely new emerged. And this is where the story of the Bronze Age collapse begins to transform from a tale of destruction into a tale of unexpected creation. Because the world that emerged from the Dark Age was, in many ways, better than the world that had been destroyed. Not immediately, not easily, not without centuries of struggle and suffering. But eventually, the collapse of the old order created the conditions for innovations that would reshape human civilization in ways that the Bronze Age world could never have imagined. If you find stories like this meaningful, if they give you something to think about as you drift towards sleep, then I want to ask you a gentle favor. When you wake tomorrow, come back and leave a comment. Tell me which part of this story surprised you the most. Tell me what you want to know more about. Those comments are not just feedback. They are conversations, and conversations are how stories stay alive. Every comment you leave helps other people find this story, other people who might be lying awake right now, looking for something to carry them into sleep. Your words might be the thing that leads them here. Now, let me tell you about what grew from the ashes. The most important innovation to emerge from the collapse was also the simplest, and you have already encountered it in this story without perhaps realizing its full significance. The alphabet. The concept of alphabetic writing, the idea that a small set of symbols can represent the sounds of speech and be combined to write any word in any language, existed before the collapse. The scribes of Ugarit had developed an alphabetic cuneiform system. The workers at the Egyptian turquoise mines in the Sinai Peninsula had scratched early alphabetic inscriptions on the walls of their tunnels, adapting Egyptian hieroglyphic symbols to represent the sounds of their Semitic language. But these early alphabets were niche inventions, used by small groups for specific purposes. The great powers of the Bronze Age had no need for them. They had their own writing systems, complex and prestigious and controlled by trained scribes who served the palace bureaucracies. Cuneiform required years of training. Egyptian hieroglyphs were the province of a specialized priesthood. Writing in the Bronze Age was a technology of power controlled by the elite, inaccessible to ordinary people. The collapse changed this. When the palaces fell and the scribes died and the complex writing systems were lost, the need for writing did not disappear. Trade continued on a smaller scale. Messages still needed to be sent. Records still needed to be kept, even if the records were now simpler and the trade was now local rather than international. And into this vacuum stepped the alphabet, specifically the Phoenician alphabet, developed by the descendants of the Canaanite coastal peoples who survived the collapse and went on to become the great seafarers and traders of the first millennium BC. The Phoenician alphabet was revolutionary in its simplicity. It had 22 letters, 22 symbols, each one representing a single consonant sound. You did not need years of training to learn it. You did not need to be part of a palace bureaucracy. Any merchant, any sailor, any farmer who needed to keep a record or send a message could learn the Phoenician alphabet in days or weeks rather than years. And because it was so simple, it spread. It spread across the Mediterranean with Phoenician traders who established colonies and trading posts from the coast of Lebanon to the coast of Spain. It was adopted by the Greeks, who added vowels to it and created the Greek alphabet. The Greek alphabet was adopted by the Etruscans and then the Romans, who created the Latin alphabet. The Latin alphabet became the writing system of the Roman Empire and, eventually, the most widely used writing system in the world. The letters you are seeing in your mind as you listen to these words, the letters of the English language, are direct descendants of the Phoenician alphabet, and the Phoenician alphabet was a product of the collapse. It existed before the collapse in protoform, but it became dominant because the collapse destroyed the complex writing systems that had previously rendered it unnecessary. The destruction of the Old World created the conditions for a democratization of literacy that the Bronze Age, with its elite scribes and its palace-controlled information systems, would never have allowed. Writing went from being a tool of power to being a tool of the people, and this transformation, arguably one of the most important in human history, happened because of the collapse, not in spite of it. There was a strange and beautiful irony here. The civilizations that fell were literate. They had writing, they had records, they had archives full of tablets documenting every aspect of their existence. And yet they were forgotten because their writing systems died with them. The civilization that emerged from the collapse, the one that survived and spread and ultimately inherited the earth, did so in part because its writing system was simple enough to survive the loss of the institutions that had created it. The complexity of Bronze Age writing was a vulnerability. The simplicity of the alphabet was a strength. And the lesson, if there is one, is that resilience sometimes comes not from complexity, but from simplicity. Not from elaborate systems, but from basic, adaptable, transferable tools that can function even when everything else has failed. The second great innovation to emerge from the collapse was the widespread adoption of iron technology. Remember the Hittites and their jealously guarded secret of iron smelting. When the Hittite Empire fell, that secret was released into the world. Hittite metalworkers, displaced by the destruction of their homeland, scattered across the Near East and the Mediterranean, taking their knowledge with them. And at the same time, the disruption of the tin trade that had sustained the bronze economy made iron an attractive alternative. Bronze required copper and tin had to be imported from thousands of miles away. Iron ore, by contrast, was available almost everywhere. It was abundant, local, and once you knew how to smelt it, far easier to obtain than the exotic ingredients required for bronze. The transition from bronze to iron was not instant. Early iron was often inferior to good bronze, softer, and more prone to rust. But the techniques improved over time, and iron had advantages that bronze could never match. It was harder when properly forged. It held a sharper edge. And most importantly, it was accessible. Any society with iron ore deposits and the knowledge to smelt them could produce iron tools and weapons without depending on international trade networks. The Iron Age liberated technology from the tyranny of long-distance supply chains. A village blacksmith with a local source of ore could produce iron tools that were as good as anything the great Bronze Age palaces had manufactured. The monopoly on advanced metallurgy that the elite had enjoyed for centuries was broken, and the benefits of metal technology were distributed more widely across society than ever before. This too was a product of the collapse. The Bronze Age system had concentrated metallurgical knowledge and resources in the hands of the palace elite. The collapse dispersed both the knowledge and the opportunity. And the Iron Age that followed was, technologically speaking, a more egalitarian era. Not immediately, not painlessly, but eventually, the spread of iron technology contributed to a transformation in the structure of society that would have been impossible within the framework of the old Bronze Age order. Let your mind rest on that thought for a moment. From destruction, innovation. From collapse, creation. From the ashes of the old world, the seeds of the new. It is not a comfortable lesson, and I do not want to romanticize it. The people who lived through the collapse did not experience it as a creative opportunity. They experienced it as catastrophe. They lost their homes, their livelihoods, their safety, their loved ones. The Dark Age that followed was a period of genuine suffering and deprivation. But the long arc of history shows that the collapse, terrible as it was not the end. It was a transition. A painful, violent, extended transition from one kind of world to another, from the centralized, palace-dominated, elite-controlled world of the Bronze Age to the more distributed, more diverse, more adaptable world of the Iron Age. And there is a third innovation that emerged from the collapse, one that is less tangible than the alphabet or iron technology, but perhaps even more important. It is the innovation of new forms of political organization. The Bronze Age world was dominated by monarchies and palace economies. Power was concentrated at the top, in the person of the king, in the bureaucracy that served him. The people at the bottom of the hierarchy had little voice and less power. They were subjects, not citizens. They served the palace, and the palace, ideally, served them in return. But the relationship was fundamentally unequal, and the collapse revealed the fatal weakness of this inequality. When the palace fell, the people had no alternative system to fall back on. They had no experience of self-governance, no institutions that could function independently of the central authority, no traditions of collective decision-making that could hold society together in the absence of a king. The civilizations that emerged from the Dark Age learned from this. Not consciously, not deliberately, but through the slow trial and error of centuries of living without palaces and kings. In Greece, the Dark Age eventually gave way to the Archaic period, during which a new form of political organization emerged, the polis, the city-state. The Greek polis was not a palace economy. It was a community of citizens who governed themselves through shared institutions, assemblies, councils, elected magistracies, and eventually, in infancy, something unprecedented in human history, democracy. The idea that ordinary people could participate in the governance of their own society, that power could be distributed rather than concentrated, that decisions could be made through debate and voting rather than royal decree, this idea was born in the aftermath of the collapse. It was not a product of the Bronze Age, it was a product of the Dark Age that followed, of centuries of living without kings, of communities that had to learn to govern themselves because there was no one else to govern them. Democracy, The political innovation that has shaped the modern world more profoundly than any other grew from the ruins of the Bronze Age. It was not invented by comfortable people living in a stable society. It was invented by the descendants of people who had lost everything, who had watched the most powerful civilization they'd ever known crumble into dust, and who had spent centuries rebuilding from scratch. They rebuilt differently because they had no choice. The old model had failed. The palace economy had proven to be fragile, centralized, and ultimately unsustainable. And so they tried something new, something that distributed power rather than concentrating it, something that relied on the participation of many rather than the authority of one, something that was, in its own way, a direct response to the catastrophe that had destroyed the world their ancestors had known. Now, I want to return to the question of why this story matters, because it is a question that has been hovering in the background of everything I have told you tonight, and I think it deserves to be addressed directly. The Bronze Age collapse matters because it is the most complete example in human history of what happens when a complex, interconnected, interdependent global system fails. It is not the only example. There are others: the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the collapse of the classic Maya civilization, the decline of the Khmer Empire. But none of these are as total, as rapid, or as comprehensive as the Bronze Age collapse. None of them involved the simultaneous destruction of every major civilization in an entire region. None of them resulted in such a complete erasure of cultural memory. The Bronze Age collapse is the extreme case, the worst-case scenario, the historical event that shows us just how bad things can get when a complex system comes apart. And it matters because the world we live in today is, in structural terms, remarkably similar to the world of the Late Bronze Age. We have a globalized economy dependent on long-distance trade and complex supply chains. We have great powers engaged in diplomatic relationships that are essential for maintaining stability, but constantly under strain. We have climate change stressing agricultural systems and displacing populations. We have growing inequality within societies creating tension and resentment. We have mass migrations driven by conflict and environmental degradation. We have technologies that are so specialized and so dependent on global supply chains that disrupting any single link can cascade through the entire system. I'm not saying that our world is about to collapse. I'm not a prophet of doom, and history does not repeat itself in neat, predictable patterns. But history does offer lessons, and the lesson of the Bronze Age collapse is clear. Complexity is not the same as resilience. Interconnection is not the same as strength. A system can be both extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily fragile. And the same features that make a system impressive, its efficiency, its specialization, its interdependence, can be the same features that make it vulnerable to cascading failure when multiple stresses converge. The people of the Bronze Age did not see the collapse coming. They could not have seen it coming, because they had no precedent for it. Nothing like it had ever happened before in their experience. They lived in the most advanced, most prosperous, most powerful world that had ever existed, and they assumed it would continue. They were wrong, and the question that hangs in the air, the question that scholars like Eric Klein have raised with increasing urgency, is whether we would see it coming if it were happening to us. Whether we would recognize the warning signs, the converging stresses, the fraying edges, the slow accumulation of small failures that precedes a systemic collapse. Whether we would act in time, or whether we would do what the kings of the Bronze Age did: send letters, request aid, fortify walls, and ultimately watch helplessly as the system they depended on came apart around them. Let that question rest unanswered in your mind. It does not need an answer tonight. Tonight it is enough to have asked it. Tonight it is enough to know that 3,200 years ago, a world as complex and as confident as our own discovered that it was not invincible, and to know that from the ruins of that world, from the ashes and the darkness and the forgetting, something new was born, something that included the alphabet you think in, the political freedoms you enjoy, the technological accessibility you take for granted. The collapse was real, the suffering was real, but so was the renewal. And the people who lived through the Dark Age, who rebuilt from nothing, who reinvented civilization in forms that would have astonished their Bronze Age ancestors, Those people were not heroes or geniuses or chosen ones. They were ordinary human beings doing what human beings have always done when the world falls apart. They adapted. They endured. They found new ways to live. And eventually, they built something that was, in many ways, better than what had come before. There is a beauty in that, a strange and painful beauty, like a forest that burns and then, years later, blooms with wildflowers that could never have grown in the shade of the old trees. The fire is not the point of the story. The flowers are not the point either. The point is the cycle. The point is that the world breaks and the world mends and the world breaks again and the world mends again. And through all of it, through all the breaking and mending, human beings persist. They tell stories. They remember, even when they have forgotten, even when the remembering takes 3,000 years and a team of archaeologists with trowels and brushes. Your breathing is slow now. Your body is heavy and warm. The ancient world is resting in its ruins, and you are resting in your bed. And between you there is a thread of story that stretches across the millennia, fragile and strong, connecting you to people whose names you will never know, but whose struggles and triumphs and losses have shaped the world you woke up in this morning and the world you will wake up in tomorrow. The island of Cyprus, which had been one of the wealthiest places in the Bronze Age thanks to its copper mines, was devastated during the collapse. Multiple cities on the island were destroyed, some by the sea peoples, some by earthquakes, some by unknown causes. But Cyprus recovered faster than most of the affected regions, in part because its copper deposits remained valuable even as the broader trade network collapsed. People still needed copper, even if they could no longer get tin to make bronze. The Cypriot copper industry adapted, and Cyprus became one of the first places in the eastern Mediterranean to re-establish trade connections in the aftermath of the collapse. Ships began to sail again. Goods began to move again. The web began to reassemble itself, strand by strand, connection by connection, over decades and centuries. And it was the Phoenicians, the heirs of the Canaanite coastal culture, who wove the new web most aggressively. From their cities of Tyre and Sidon and Byblos on the coast of modern Lebanon, the Phoenicians sent their ships out across the Mediterranean, farther than any Bronze Age traders had ever gone. They established colonies at Carthage in North Africa, at Cadiz in Spain, on the islands of Sardinia and Sicily and Malta. They traded in everything. Textiles dyed with the famous Tyrian purple, glass, metalwork, timber, wine, and they carried the alphabet with them wherever they went. The Phoenicians were the bridge between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, the connective tissue that linked the old world to the new. They preserved enough of the old knowledge to make the new knowledge possible, and they spread it so widely that it could never again be lost to a single catastrophe. There is a story about the Phoenician city of Byblos that I want to share with you because it captures something essential about the resilience of human civilization. Byblos is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. It has been occupied for at least 7,000 years, possibly longer. It survived the Bronze Age collapse. It survived the conquests of the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the Crusaders, the Ottomans. It is still there today, a city in modern Lebanon, its ancient ruins sitting beside modern buildings, layer upon layer of human habitation, stretching back to before the invention of writing. The word Bible comes from Byblos, because the city was so famous as a source of papyrus that the Greeks named the material after the city, and the name eventually attached itself to the most famous book in the world. Byblos endured through everything, through every collapse and every conquest and every dark age and every renewal, not because it was powerful, not because it was protected by great walls or great armies, but because it was useful, because it was adaptable, because the people who lived there found ways to be valuable to whoever held power in any given era. They traded, they adapted, they survived, and they are still there. There is something comforting in that, in the knowledge that some things endure, that the thread of human civilization, however many times it is stretched to the breaking point, does not break entirely. That somewhere, in some small city on some coast, someone is always keeping the flame alive, preserving just enough knowledge, just enough connection, just enough connection, just enough continuity to bridge the gap between what was and what will be. There is a room in the British Museum in London where you can stand face to face with the Bronze Age and feel the weight of everything we have been talking about tonight. It is not a grand room. It is not one of the famous galleries that draw millions of tourists every year. It is a quieter space, easier to miss, and in it there are clay tablets, small, unassuming, covered in the wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform script, each one fitting comfortably in the palm of your hand. Some of them are cracked. Some have chipped at the edges. Some are darkened by fire, the fire that destroyed the buildings where they were stored, the fire that also, paradoxically, preserved them by baking the wet clay into permanence. These tablets are letters, diplomatic correspondence between kings who ruled empires that no longer exist, written in a language that no living person spoke for over 2,000 years until scholars painstakingly taught themselves to read it again in the 19th century. And if you stand in that room and hold one of those tablets in your mind, if you imagine the hand that pressed those marks into wet clay 3,200 years ago, the scribe sitting cross-legged on a mud brick floor in a palace that is now dust, carefully forming each wedge with a reed stylus, recording a message from his king to a distant brother king, requesting gold or grain or a physician for a sick princess. If you imagine that hand, that moment and that world, you will feel something is difficult. It is not quite sadness, it is not quite wonder. It is something in between, something that has to do with the fragility of everything we make and the stubbornness of everything we leave behind. Those tablets survived. The empires did not. The trade networks did not. The diplomatic relationships did not. The cities and palaces and temples did not. But the tablets, small and plain and easily overlooked, endured. They lay in the earth for millennia, patient and silent, holding their messages like seeds waiting for the right conditions to germinate. And when they were finally unearthed and finally read, the world they described came back to life. Not fully, not completely. We will never know most of what happened in the Bronze Age. We will never hear the songs that were sung, or the jokes that were told, or the prayers that were whispered in the temples at night. We will never know the names of the farmers who grew the grain, or the sailors who crewed the ships, or the mothers who held their children while the fires burned. But we know something. We know enough to reconstruct the outlines of a lost world, to understand its achievements and its failures, to learn from its example. And we know because of clay, because someone pressed marks into wet earth and the earth remembered. Let your body be as still as those tablets now. Let your thoughts be as quiet as the rooms where they rest. The story has been long tonight, and it has covered a lot of ground, from the golden palaces of Ramses to the burning docks of Ugarit, from the cracking walls of Tiryns to the empty silence of a Greece that forgot how to write. It has been a story about power and vulnerability, about connection and collapse, about the things we build and the things we lose, and the things that somehow, against all odds, survive. I want to spend these final moments of our journey together, not in the ancient world, but in the space between the ancient world and ours, because that space is where the meaning of this story lives. Not in the facts, though the facts are extraordinary. Not in the theories, though the theories are compelling, but in the space between then and now, in the recognition that we are connected to those ancient people not by blood or culture or language, but by something deeper, by the shared experience of building complex worlds and hoping they will last, by the shared vulnerability of living in systems we do not fully understand and cannot fully control, by the shared human impulse to write things down, to press marks into clay or ink onto paper or light onto screens, hoping that someone, someday, will read what we wrote and understand what we meant. The kings of the Bronze Age wrote to each other constantly. The Amarna Letters, those 382 tablets of diplomatic correspondence, are a monument to the human need to communicate, to maintain relationships across distance, to keep the conversation going even when the parties involved do not particularly like or trust each other. The king of Babylon complains that the pharaoh's gold is substandard. The pharaoh deflects. The king of Assyria feels snubbed because his gifts were not reciprocated appropriately. the pharaoh explains, unconvincingly. Vassal rulers plead for military aid that never comes. The whole collection reads like a cross between a diplomatic archive and a family email chain, full of passive aggression and genuine concern and desperate attempts to be heard by someone who might not be listening. And the most remarkable thing about these letters is not what they say. It is that they exist at all. That in a world without telephones or internet or postal services, kings separated by hundreds of miles maintained ongoing correspondence through messengers who travelled for weeks across deserts and mountains to deliver small clay tablets inscribed with words that the recipients might or might not bother to respond to. The effort involved was enormous. The infrastructure required was substantial: maintained roads, relay stations, trained scribes at both ends, translators who could work between languages. And the purpose of all this effort was simply to stay connected, to maintain the web of relationships that held the world together, to keep talking. When the talking stopped, the world ended. That is not a metaphor. That is what happened. When the diplomatic correspondence ceased, when the messengers stopped travelling, when the scribes stopped writing and the kings stopped reading, the web of relationships that had sustained the Bronze Age world dissolved. The silence was not just a symptom of the collapse, it was part of the mechanism. Communication was the glue, and when it failed, the pieces came apart. I find myself thinking about this often, about the relationship between communication and civilization, about the fact that the most complex and successful societies in human history are always the ones with the most robust communication systems. The Romans had their roads and their postal service. The Mongols had their relay stations stretching across the breadth of Asia. The British Empire had the telegraph and the undersea cable. We have the internet, and all of these systems, ancient and modern, serve the same fundamental purpose. They keep the conversation going. They maintain the web of connection that holds complex societies together. And the lesson of the Bronze Age is that when the communication fails, when the web is disrupted, when the messages stop getting through, the society that depends on that communication is in mortal danger. The last letter from Ugarit was never sent. That unbaked tablet sitting in an unfired kiln is not just a historical artifact. It is a symbol of what happens when the communication system breaks down so completely that even a king's desperate plea for help cannot find its way to its intended recipient. The message existed. The need was real. The words were formed and pressed into clay by a scribe who understood the urgency. But the system that was supposed to carry the message from sender to receiver had already collapsed. The infrastructure was gone. The ships that might have carried it were burning in the harbour. The kingdom that was supposed to receive it was dealing with its own catastrophe and had no aid to send even if the letter had arrived. The letter is a perfect encapsulation of the Bronze Age collapse, not the destruction itself, but the failure of connection, the severing of the threads that had held the world together. And here is the thought I want to leave you with as you drift towards sleep. The threads can be rewoven. They always can. The Bronze Age world collapsed, but the world did not end. The Dark Age was long and painful, but it was not permanent. Human beings, with their stubborn, irrepressible need to connect and communicate and build and trade and tell stories, eventually rewove the web. They did it differently. They used new materials, an alphabet instead of cuneiform, iron instead of bronze, city-states instead of palace economies. But the impulse was the same, the need was the same, and the result, eventually, was a world that was in many ways richer and more resilient than the one that had been lost. The Phoenicians carried the alphabet across the Mediterranean. The Greeks reinvented politics. The Israelites reimagined religion. The Assyrians rebuilt an empire, a harsh one, but a functioning one, that restored order to the Near East. And from all of these threads, woven together over centuries, a new tapestry emerged, a tapestry that would eventually include the Persian Empire and the conquest of Alexander, and the glory of Rome and the spread of Christianity and Islam and the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and the Digital Age. All of it, every chapter of human history that followed the Bronze Age collapse was built on the ruins of what came before, not in spite of the collapse, but because of it, because the collapse cleared the ground, because it broke the old patterns and forced people to invent new ones, because it demonstrated in the most painful way possible that the old ways were not the only ways, and that when the old world ends, a new world begins. This does not make the suffering worthwhile. Nothing makes suffering worthwhile. The people who starved during the famines, the people who died in the fires, the people who fled their homes with nothing and wandered the Mediterranean looking for safety that did not exist, their pain was real, and it was not redeemed by the eventual emergence of better systems centuries later. History is not a morality tale. It does not arrange events to teach lessons or reward virtue or punish failure. It simply happens, driven by forces that are often beyond any individual's ability to control or even understand. And the most honest thing we can say about the Bronze Age collapse is that it happened, that it was terrible, that it was probably unavoidable given the structural vulnerabilities of the system, and that the human beings who lived through it and after it found ways to go on, not because they were special, because that is what human beings do. Think about Byblos again, that small city on the Lebanese coast that has been continuously inhabited for 7,000 years. For every catastrophe, through every dark age, through every conquest and every collapse, someone was living in Byblos. Someone was fishing in its harbour, trading in its market, raising children in its houses, telling stories in its streets. The great empires rose and fell around it like tides, and Byblos remained, not unchanging. It changed constantly, adapting to each new reality, absorbing each new culture, finding its place in each new order. But it endured, and its endurance is a testament not to the permanence of any particular civilization, but to the permanence of the human spirit that underlies all civilizations. The spirit that builds and rebuilds and refuses to stop building, even when everything it has built comes crashing down. You carry that spirit in you. It is not something you have to earn or achieve. It is something you inherited from a chain of ancestors that stretches back not just through recorded history, but through the Dark Ages and the collapses and the renewals that punctuate human history like heartbeats. Your ancestors survived the Bronze Age collapse, not necessarily in the direct genetic sense, though statistically some of them almost certainly did, but in the deeper sense that the human lineage, the unbroken chain of human survival and adaptation and resilience, passed through that catastrophe and came out the other side. And every civilization that followed, every achievement that makes your life what it is today, is proof that the collapse was not the end of the story. It was a chapter. A terrible, painful, devastating chapter. But a chapter, not an ending. The night outside your window is quiet now. Or perhaps it is not quiet. Perhaps there are sirens in the distance, or the hum of traffic, or the sound of rain, or the breathing of someone sleeping beside you. Whatever sounds surround you, they are the sounds of a world that is still running, still functioning, still holding together. And the story I have told you tonight, the story of a world that stopped running and stopped functioning and stopped holding together 3,200 years ago, is not a warning, it is not a prophecy, it is a reminder that the things we build are precious precisely because they are fragile, that the connections we maintain, the conversations we keep going, the relationships we nurture, these are not luxuries. They are the threads that hold the web together. And as long as we keep weaving, keep talking, keep reaching across the distances that separate us, the web holds. It held for centuries in the Bronze Age. It holds today. And with care and attention and a willingness to learn from the past, it can hold for a long time to come. But even if it does not hold, even if the threads fray and the web tears and the world we know undergoes its own version of the Bronze Age collapse, the story of 1200 BC tells us something essential. It tells us that the darkness is not forever. It tells us that the human capacity to rebuild, to reinvent, to find new ways of living when the old ways fail, is as fundamental to our nature as breathing. It tells us that from the ashes of every collapse, something new grows. Not immediately, not painlessly, but inevitably, because that is what humans do. We build, we lose, we grieve, and then we build again. The Hittites are not gone. Their empire is dust, but the iron smelting techniques they pioneered eventually spread across the world and built the Iron Age and the Steel Age in the modern world. The Mycenaeans are not gone. Their palaces are ruins, but the stories they inspired, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are still read and loved and taught 3,000 years later. Ugarit is not gone. Its buildings are rubble, but the alphabetic principle its scribes developed is alive in every text message, every email, every book, every street sign in the world. The Bronze Age world collapsed. Everything its people built was destroyed. And yet, somehow, nothing they created was entirely lost. It was transformed. It was carried forward in new forms by new peoples who did not know where their innovations came from. It was preserved in the earth, in tablets and ruins and shipwrecks, waiting to be discovered and understood by descendants who had forgotten they were descendants. Nothing is truly lost. That is the final lesson of the Bronze Age collapse. Things are transformed, displaced, hidden, buried, forgotten. But given enough time and enough curiosity and enough willingness to dig, they can be found again. And finding them changes us, because it connects us to a past we did not know we had, to ancestors we did not know we had, to a story we did not know we were part of. You are part of that story. You have been part of it since the moment you were born, though you may not have known it until tonight. And now you know. You know about the Uluburun ship and its cargo from 7 civilizations resting on the sea floor. You know about the Amarna Letters and the kings who called each other brother. You know about the Cyclopean walls of Tiryns and the Lion Gate of Mycenae, and the great temple at Abu Simbel with its 4 colossal statues staring out across the desert. You know about the drought that weakened the harvests, and the earthquakes that cracked the walls, and the sea peoples who came from nowhere and everywhere. You know about the last letter from Ugarit, unbaked and unsent, preserved by the very fire that destroyed the city. And you know that the world that was destroyed was not destroyed forever, that from its ashes grew the alphabet and iron and democracy and everything that followed. Carry this knowledge gently. It does not need to weigh you down. It is not a burden. It is a gift from 3,200 years ago, from scribes and merchants and kings and farmers and sailors who had no idea that anyone would ever hear their story again. They wrote their letters and kept their records and built their cities and fought their battles and loved their families and worried about the future, just as you do. And they could not have known in their wildest imaginings that 32 centuries later, someone would be lying in a warm bed in a world they could not have conceived of, listening to their story, feeling connected to them across the unimaginable gulf of time, finding comfort and wonder and a strange kind of companionship in the knowledge of their existence. But here you are, and there they were, and the story connects you, a thread of words stretching across the millennia, fragile as a spider's web and strong as iron, holding the past and the present together in a single shimmering strand. The room around you is quiet. Your body is heavy and warm. Your breathing is slow and even, a rhythm as old as the species itself, as constant as the tides that washed the shores of Ugarit and Byblos and the beaches of Mycenaean Greece. The ancient world is sleeping in its ruins. The letters are resting in their museum cases. The shipwreck is lying on the seafloor, its cargo of copper and tin and amber and ebony slowly becoming part of the geology of the Mediterranean. And you are here, in your bed, in your life, in your own small chapter of the vast human story, and you are safe, and you are warm, and the world outside your window, whatever its troubles, is still turning. Let the story settle into you now, the way sediment settles to the bottom of a calm sea. Let the facts and the names and the dates drift away if they want to. They will be here if you want to return to them. What matters tonight is not the details. What matters is the feeling. The feeling of being connected to something ancient and ongoing and larger than any single life or any single civilization. The feeling of being part of a story that began before you were born and will continue after you are gone. The feeling that the thread does not break, that the web can always be rewoven, that the darkness always gives way to light, even if the light takes centuries to arrive. 3,200 years ago, a king sat in a burning city and wrote a letter asking for help. The help did not come. The letter was never sent. But the story was not over. It was never over. It is not over now, and as you close your eyes and let sleep carry you wherever it wants to take you, know that you are part of the continuation. You are part of the rebuilding. You are part of the proof that when the world falls apart, human beings find a way to put it back together. Not perfectly, not quickly, but inevitably. Because that is who we are. That is what we do. And that is what we will always do. The stars that watch the fires at Ugarit are the same stars watching over you tonight. They have not changed. They are patient. They have seen civilizations rise and fall like waves on a shore, and they will see many more before they are done. And under those patient stars, the world keeps turning, and the stories keep being told, and the letters keep being written. And somewhere, in some small city on some coast, someone is always keeping the flame alive. Good night. Sleep well. Let the ancient world hold you gently as you drift away, and know that you are held and you are safe. And the story goes on. And when you wake, if this journey has given you something, wonder or peace or simply the comfort of a voice in the dark, there are more stories waiting for you right here on this channel. Stories about lost civilizations and forgotten empires, and the hidden forces that have shaped the world you live in. Stories designed to carry you gently into the deepest, most restful sleep of your life. You can see them on your screen right now. Choose the one that calls to you, and let it be your companion for another night. I will be here whenever you need me, with another story, another journey, another reason to be amazed at the depth and beauty and resilience of the human story. Sweet dreams.